All right, so I'm going to be talking a bit about applying max pressure to your opponents when you have position. I've been getting several different questions about this and about the infamous red line in Hold a Manager and other graphs, your non-showdown winnings, and kind of how to uh, have that above zero, essentially. At least having it flat or that you're showing profit in your non-showdown winnings. And it has a lot to do with really targeting and isolating the players at your limits that you feel like you can tell a story to, and you can get them off of better hands often enough. That they have enough knowledge to kind of understand what your range is going to be, but they're not going to push really small edges themselves and can fold better hands a lot of the time. So finding those players at your stakes is really going to be the trick. I think I'm using this 50 NL as an example, which I think is probably the in between stake where you can kind of do this, but there's still going to be a lot of players that don't fully have a grasp of what level you might be thinking on and how to really read that and play back and react at that. And then as you move up stakes, you're going to have a lot more players that have a firmer grasp of hand ranges and how to push smaller edges. So taking advantage of them is a lot more difficult, but you're going to want to mainly do it when you have position. Then as you start moving smaller stakes from here, it gets trickier and trickier because the knowledge and how people are understanding when you might be leveling them or not really decreases. So in some ways you can take advantage of that, and you can get them to make certain mistakes by just applying the right pressure at the right time. But at the same time, there's a lot of them who can't fold or don't really fully understand the story that you're trying to tell, and will make mistakes when certain hands they should be folding based on how you are trying to portray or paint the hand. They're not going to fully grasp, so you kind of have to be careful. So I call this kind of in between stake, and that's why I kind of use this as an example, because I'm playing all sorts of different stakes right now, and this I think is a perfect example of knowing exactly where someone is, targeting the perfect kind of player where we have a reg that understands the game clearly. We have enough info on them. They're 30-23 with 9.7% 3-bet, and but they can fold if you apply the right pressure. So I'm just going to run through this hand and kind of talk a little bit about the dynamics of how and what you should be considering before you even make this call pre-flop. So our primary target in this hand is the fishy player who ends up calling, but our secondary target is our reg that we identified as someone who's good enough that they can fold some hands, they can understand ranges and the story that we would tell, like how would we play this hand, what would make sense, so we can tell a consistent story that they would believe. And so a reg being 30-23 with 9.7% 3-bet, we're looking at them as like a secondary target when we decide to call with 9-8 offsuit on the button. So as it turns out, flop middle pair on a king high board, rainbow, our reg leads out this pot and fishy player folds. So this isn't the ideal scenario that we wanted. We of course wanted to get the fish heads up and get a hand where we could win a big pot from them. But our secondary target is also a good option, and that's why we use the button and look to play a hand where we can possibly steal a pot from our opponent who is holding a better hand. So first things first, a breakdown, because this is, this kind of play is not limited to this specific example. I pulled this one out from a recent hand just to give an example of something that I think is very commonly available if you look for it properly. And again, it's about targeting the right kind of player. So You can't just say, "Oh, I want to make this play, and this is going on, and I have this kind of hand, and everything like that." You're not really doing what good poker players do at that point, because it's not just about the fact that you have X or Y, Z hands, about your opponent. So that's got to be the first thing that you're really focusing on, because I could tell the best story in the world and play a hand brilliantly against someone who is clueless, and it'll make no sense because they're going to call with middle pair or whatever else it is, um, and make me look like an idiot. So, anyways, I'm also not going to break down the math EV of what each line is going to take. There's tools you can use for that. And again, it's not about this specific hand, because the board textures and all these kinds of things will change what the exact EV is. It's about how do I set my opponent up and tell the story I want to tell, and what are some of the best options to do that. And this is what I found is a consistently profitable play if you're picking the right opponents. Have I made this line sometimes and somebody shows up with a big hand, or traps me or things like that? Absolutely. But that's part of playing poker. But overall, you're going to find profitability if you do pick the right spot. Um, so the two options here are, we're not going to fold. So it's call or raise. And, why is one line better than the other? Again, I'm not going to break down the EV of this particular hand and so on and so on. I'm going to talk about uh, a play that can apply to a lot of situations, in a very similar spot where you flop middle pair, bottom pair, or maybe have complete air. So here we have middle pair, so that's good, because if our opponent does have a hand like King X or tens or jacks or things like that, we can outturn them, or outriver them. We have position, so it's much more likely that we'll be able to get to the river. So the probability when you have position of seeing two cards increases dramatically, and so we want to take advantage of that. So I think some opponents would call here, and then you're going to be stuck in a lot of situations where you're going to be facing a double barrel against a range that's still not completely defined. Now, of course, our opponent bet into two people on the flop, so we're going to give them a little bit more credit for their hand, but it still can include some hands like ace queen suited, some semi-bluffs like 7-9, and then all the value hands that are in there: sevens, nines, tens, jacks, queens, king X, aces, so on and so on, sets. So the value of calling here isn't going to be able to tell the story we want, because if we're going to look to steal this possibly later against our opponent's better hand, then uh, we can call, of course, and see if they slow down, but a lot of regs are going to fire because they're going to understand you flatted here. Maybe the best you can have in this spot is king queen, something of that nature, unless you're trapping. So they're going to fire a lot of turns, and sometimes that could be pure bluffs, something that they picked up, that made a better, like a draw for them, those things. Our likelihood that our opponent would be on a pure bluff on the turn is reduced because of the flop scenario. Like I said, bet into two opponents here. So the thing is, can we get them to fold a better hand if we raise? How often, with position, will they, just give up with nines, tens, jacks, queens, and stuff like that? Well, they may not just purely give up on the flop. We can raise here. They might be suspicious. Oh, why would they raise here? But it's a pretty dry board, so on and so on. But we could definitely raise with sets, and this also is going to factor into how you play as a player as well. So if you're never raising top pair in these kinds of situations, it's going to reduce the effectiveness of making this kind of play. And it's something you might want to consider doing, because as you get more history with your opponents, what kinds of hands you have in situations, what you show up, is really going to play a huge role in how they decide to play against you. And at these kinds of stakes and below and stuff, it's not going to factor as much. You're not going to have a ton of history, but as you go from this point and on, and you build some history, it's going to factor in. So you're going to want to consider that. And even if it might seem slightly minus EV in that particular spot, and if you feel like you're going to be playing against this player a lot, it can be good to do. Like if you literally had King Queen here. To raise, and there's a lot of reasons to also do that because they might also slow down, and you can also get to a cheaper showdown. You'll find that when you raise, it really puts players on hold unless they have a big hand themselves, and the goal of what we're going to do here versus calling is raise because we want our player to really define their hand for us and give us a chance to see a bunch of cards to possibly either suck out against their hand or set them up for a big bluff. And if we just call here again, we're going to be stuck with a lot of really weird situations and stack sizes on the turn. So I don't think the most effective play when we're starting with roughly 100 big blinds is to call and then look to raise the turn. I don't think it's completely horrible, but then you're really giving up your equity, and I think a better spot to do that is right away on the flop, because if you get re-raised here, you're done with the hand. If he just calls, you give yourself a real high probability of seeing the turn and the river, and like I said, sucking out or bluffing. So, the actual EV, if we're going to break this down mathematically, has a lot to do with our opponent's calling and re-raising tendencies. But I'll tell you and I don't play a ton at these stakes. I've played a little bit recently, so I have some insight, but I wouldn't consider myself an expert, as I've usually played slightly to much higher stakes. But usually your opponent will, even if they do call in a spot like this, eventually they'll give up your hand if you apply enough pressure. So here we are going to raise, and we're going to raise a size that allows for us to have at least a pot size bet when we decide to bluff, or ideally slightly over. Slightly over really applies max pressure, and if we get the right run out, then the effectiveness drastically increases. So our fold equity is going to skyrocket, and our opponent calling down with one pair of hands is really going to be reduced, which is what we want. And we'll be able to figure out by the time we do get to the river if they do have a one pair hand or not. So here Jack comes off on the turn, our opponent checks again, and here again is not where we want to make our bluff, because not that I think betting here is horrible, but I think right away, if we were going to punch this in EV wise, I don't think our fold percent is going to be very high, because maybe they call with tens on the flop and fold here, but probably not. They're probably not going to believe that we have something like King Jack. We want to see them completely define their hand for us and have something that gives us a really nice run out where we can represent several different hands that would make sense, or some that maybe bluffed at some point but made a big hand by the end. But the bottom line is, even if it's slightly suspicious, I think at these stakes and around here and 100 no limit and stuff like that, you're going to get a ton of folds with one pair of hands. So we do check behind here on the turn, and 10 comes off on the river, opponent checks again, and so now they've really defined their hand for us. They're probably going to lead with two pair of hands and sets and other things like that at this point. So it's very narrow, really down to king queen, ace king, maybe queens, aces, things of that nature. So they very likely don't have jacks, kings, tens, any of those kinds of sets or anything like that, or draws. And so now we can represent something like 7-9 that hit on the river, and maybe some two pair hands that would have to at least run through their mind a little bit, like King 10, King Jack, even though those aren't highly believable hands, but it's not completely out of the realm of possibility. So Anyways, we shove, which was our plan, slightly over pot size, bet 37 and 25, and our opponent folds. And even running through this hand, which uh, this happened a few days ago, that was this is the exact hand that I would have put him on aces or ace king, knowing that they could fold this hand, which they did, and scooped a nice pot. So the keys here really are targeting your opponent, allowing them to tell you where their hand strength is, and getting somewhat reasonable run out. I mean, if the board comes out deuce three, we're probably not going to follow through here. You know, especially if we check the turn. I think if the turn comes a deuce, we have it's probably much better to try and bet and take the pot down there, with something like a three-quarter size pot, and just completely give up your equity if your opponent shoves. But something like Jack, we can really work with and creates some some more hands that would possibly be in our range. Like I said, it's not going to be highly likely we raise King Jack on the flop, and then check the turn, but it's not completely out of the realm either. But really the hand that we're primarily telling our story about here is 7-9, and but again, there are some hands here that do make sense. I mean, could even consider maybe we raise pocket tens and don't, because well, we don't know how to play it all that great. We don't have a whole lot of history with our opponents, so they don't really know how we play. And then we hit the jackpot on the river. But regardless, calling down here with the ace king, king queen, ace ace type hand is not going to be super easy. And sometimes you will get called, but most of the time, I'd say well over 85% of the time you're going to get a fold. So then you can add up the math there and see that it's very plus EV. So good luck. So I just want to show you quickly what I think is a good red line at something like 50 NL. So I'm able to play 10,000 hands or so at these stakes. It's not going to be skyrocketing off the charts because the weak players are going to be so much weaker, not able to fold, and so the non-showdown winnings aren't going to be great. Versus when you get up in the 1, 2, and 2, 4, no limit, the non-showdown winnings will go up a lot. But I think this is a pretty good where you're keep it somewhat above zero, and just pick your spots well. I'll show you just also my other general stats from these stakes.